The gold spike ceremony was photographed. The telegram went round the world. 2 locomotives touched noses at a Utah summit and the crowd cheered. The 10,000 men who built the western half of the line were somewhere else that day. Not invited to the picture. Promontory Summit, Utah Territory, May 10, 1869. The photograph was arranged carefully. Leland Stanford, president of the Central Pacific Railroad, stood on one side. Thomas Durant, vice president of the Union Pacific, stood on the other. Dignitaries in top hats, officers in uniform, laborers, but not all laborers, specific ones, chosen, white ones, placed in the frame. 2 locomotives faced each other on the newly completed track. A bottle of champagne was waiting. A golden spike had been engraved with the words, "May God continue the unity of our country as this railroad unites the 2 great oceans of the world." Stanford swung the hammer at the spike and missed. Durant swung and missed too. Someone else drove the spike home. The telegraph operator sent a signal. Done. The crowd cheered. The champagne was opened. The century turned a corner. The 10,000 Chinese workers who had just built most of the hardest 2,000 miles of the western portion of the Transcontinental Railroad were not in the photograph. They were not invited. The Central Pacific Railroad began work at Sacramento in 1863, heading east toward a connection with the Union Pacific, which was building west from Omaha. The 2 lines would meet somewhere in the middle and complete the first transcontinental railroad in North American history, a project so enormous it required federal land grants and government bonds worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The Union Pacific had an easier route, across the Great Plains, which were flat and dry. The Central Pacific had the Sierra Nevada in its way. The Sierra Nevada, 200 miles of granite mountains rising to more than 11,000 feet, with winters that buried everything in 20 feet of snow, cliffs that dropped hundreds of feet on either side of a proposed route, and no practical machinery for cutting through solid rock. The Central Pacific ran out of workers within the first year. California's white laborers were easily distracted by mining opportunities and unwilling to do the most dangerous work. Charles Crocker, the railroad's chief construction superintendent, looked at the unemployed men in Sacramento's Chinatown and made a decision. The first Chinese workers arrived on the Central Pacific Line in 1865. There were 50 of them. Hired as an experiment, they were paid $26 a month, $28 less than white workers received for equivalent labor. They were quiet, they worked. Crocker said later that a people who had built the Great Wall could build a railroad. This was both condescending and an underestimation, because the Great Wall had not required drilling through solid granite mountains with nitroglycerin. The drilling teams worked in pairs. 1 man held the drill. 1 man swung the hammer. They had to communicate in near-perfect synchrony through hours of effort, because the alternative was a missed swing at a 3-inch drill bit, and a missed swing at that speed shattered bones. When they reached the sheer cliff faces of Cape Horn above the American River, cliffs that no human being had previously stood on, the Chinese workers were lowered in wicker baskets suspended by ropes. They drilled holes in the cliff face. They packed the holes with black powder. They lit the fuse. They shouted up to be hauled out before the blast. Sometimes they were hauled out in time. By 1866, the Central Pacific had 10,000 Chinese workers on the line. They were roughly 90% of the workforce. They reached the summit of the Sierra Nevada and discovered that winter conditions made surface work impossible. The solution was to tunnel under the snow, to build a city of snow tunnels and work by lantern light through the Sierra Nevada winter, moving through the mountain rather than waiting for the mountain to permit passage. They lived in this underground world for months. When they emerged and began the descent into Nevada, Crocker organized a race. The Chinese teams completed 10 miles of track in a single day, a record that has not been broken since. In the summer of 1867, the Chinese workers went on strike. They had been working for 2 years in conditions that killed men regularly. Collapsed tunnels, premature explosions, avalanches, 40-foot drops in poorly secured baskets. They had watched white workers earn substantially more for the same work. They wanted equal pay. They wanted shorter hours in the deep tunnels where the air was bad and the work killed fastest. They wanted to not be beaten by overseers. Crocker responded by cutting off their food supply. The workers had no stores, no money, no alternative. They returned to work after 1 week without any of their demands being met. They finished the railroad. The Chinese Exclusion Act was signed into law in 1882. 13 years after the Golden Spike. It was the first and only American law ever to bar a specific nationality from immigration and naturalization. Chinese people already in the country could not become citizens. New Chinese immigrants could not enter. The law was initially passed for 10 years. It was renewed, then made permanent, then finally repealed in 1943. When China was an American ally in World War II and the optics became impossible to sustain. The men who had built the Transcontinental Railroad were thanked with a law barring them from the country they had helped build. They were not in the photograph. They were not in the law, except as people to be excluded. For 150 years, the names of the Chinese workers who built the Central Pacific were largely unknown. The railroad kept payroll records, lists of China number 1, China number 2, sometimes a name rendered phonetically by an English-speaking clerk who could not write it correctly. Many were lost, many were never recorded. In 2014, Stanford University, founded by Leland Stanford, whose fortune came in part from the railroad, began a project to recover these names. The Chinese Railroad Workers in North America project gathered records from across California and China, working with descendants, with village records, with documents in Cantonese and Hakka that had been sitting in archives unread. They recovered thousands of names. Not all of them. There are still men in that photograph who are not in it. But the names are coming back, one by one, from ledgers no one thought to look at. There is a story from the construction that the workers told about the day the tunnels met. 2 teams had been drilling from opposite sides of a Sierra Nevada ridge, a process that required precise engineering to ensure the tunnels would meet in the middle rather than miss each other in the dark. When the 2 teams broke through and saw each other's lanterns through the last inches of granite, there was a moment of silence. Then, from both sides, cheering. They had done something no one had ever done before. They had put a road through a mountain. The ceremony was not for them. The road is still there. If this story hit you, if the weight of what was built and what was erased lands the way it should, hit the like button. It costs 2 seconds and it tells the algorithm this kind of history deserves to be found. Share it with someone who doesn't know this story. And if you're not subscribed, now is the time. 60 of these are coming. One hidden history at a time. Subscribe, like, share. I'll see you in the next one.